The snow had not let up in 3 days. It fell in slow, deliberate sheets, blanketing the land in a silence that swallowed sound. The wind did not howl, it sighed weary and bitter, slipping under coats and through the bones of those who had the misfortune of still being outside. Clara knelt beside the broken wagon, one glove torn at the fingertips, blood seeping into the snow where her knuckles had scraped the iron wheel. Her youngest Eli whimpered in his sleep beneath the oilcloth wrapped tight in her wool shawl. Ruth, her daughter, sat stiff and silent, boots drawn up to her chest, eyes locked on the dying fire that hissed against the damp. They had left Dawson Creek with the last of their coin and an envelope of false hope her late husband's cousin had written, said there was work, said there was room. But when they arrived 2 nights past, the man had not come to the station. They waited in the biting cold, then walked the 3 miles to his ranch. The door had opened a crack, a woman's face, peeking out pity already in her eyes. "He passed last spring," she'd said, "and we don't take in strays." That door had closed, soft but final. Clara hadn't cried then, not even when Eli asked if they were going home now. There was no home. Only this patch of snowbound earth, 3 miles from Mercy and 20 from the nearest town, if the map was to be believed. She had one biscuit left, a jar of lard, and the ache in her joints that told her the fever would be back by nightfall. Her hands trembled as she stood. The wagon leaned to one side, axle cracked, wheel useless. No horses, those had been sold 2 counties back for a ride on the freight wagon. She wasn't sure what had possessed her to keep the busted cart. Some scrap of pride, maybe, or the belief that shelter was better than none. The sky was a flat white, no shape to it, just an endless lid pressing down. Clara crossed to her children. Ruth didn't look up, but Eli stirred, soft and warm and trusting beneath the shawl. She placed a hand on his back. The rise and fall of his breath was steady. That at least had not abandoned her. She would walk again today. Try another house, another stretch of empty prairie. Perhaps someone would open their door. She rubbed warmth into her palms and tucked a curl behind Ruth's ear. "I'll be back before dark," she said. Her daughter nodded but did not speak. The wind picked up as she walked. The snow wasn't deep, not yet, but her boots were thin and her feet wet before she reached the fence line. There was no path. Only white and more white, with the occasional black skeleton of a tree reaching toward the gray sky like a plea. Then she saw a figure on horseback cresting the ridge, slow and watchful. She stopped walking, chest tightening, not with hope, not yet, just something like alertness. Readiness. The rider was wrapped in a wool coat, hat pulled low, snow coating his shoulders. He didn't rush. He moved like a man who knew the land beneath his horse's hooves and didn't fear it. His gaze swept the plain and landed on her alone, ragged, too light for the snow. He reined in. Clara said nothing. Her throat was too dry. She stood her ground, though her legs wavered. He was quiet a long while before speaking. "You headed somewhere?" She blinked. The sound of his voice was rough but not cruel. "We were supposed to stay with family," she said, voice thin. "They're gone now." His eyes scanned the horizon behind her, settling on the broken wagon, the curl of smoke, barely visible. "You've children?" She nodded. "You've food?" She hesitated. "Not enough." More silence. The horse shifted beneath him. He looked at the sky, then back at her. "There's a barn 2 miles south. Mine. Warm enough and dry. You can bring them." Clara didn't move, didn't breathe. "Not asking for work," he said. "Or thanks. Just reckon no one ought to die on a day like this." Still she stood. "Ma'am." She felt something slip inside her, some thread too thin to carry weight, but too stubborn to break. It could have been pride, could have been disbelief, could have been the part of her that no longer trusted men who spoke like they meant well. But then she turned. began to walk back toward the wagon. He watched her the whole time. He came back with her, rode behind at a distance that said he meant no harm but wasn't afraid to be seen. His name, she later learned, was Luke Mercer. He hadn't offered it that first day. Just led her to his barn, helped her carry Eli inside while Ruth followed with the blanket bundle of their things. The barn was old but solid. The wood creaked in the wind, but it held firm and the hay was dry. There was an iron stove in the corner, dented but working. Luke lit it with practiced ease and left them a pail of water, a sack of oats, and half a smoked ham. Clara hadn't known what to say. Her hands had fumbled with the stove door, too numb from cold and shock to work the latch. He'd done it for her, said nothing while she wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, and then left before the kettle had even started to steam. That night, Eli curled into her side, warm and full for the first time in days. Ruth lay on the hay, watching the smoke rise through the cracks in the rafters. She didn't speak until the fire burned low. "Is he going to send us away too?" Clara looked at her daughter. The child's face was pale, streaked with soot and salt. "I don't know," she said. But he didn't today. It became clear over the next week that Luke Mercer was not a man of many words. He brought them wood and food without asking questions. Left tools leaning against the barn wall. A better blanket. Once he brought Ruth a pair of boots, not new but clean her size. They appeared one morning lined up beside the stove like they had always belonged there. Clara made use of everything. She boiled water and scrubbed the children's clothes' patched holes, wiped their faces raw with rag and snowmelt. When the barn was clean, she started on the tools, organizing them, oiling hinges, mending harness straps with thread from her own hem. The silence between her and Luke held steady. He never came inside the barn, but she saw him sometimes from the loft, moving through the snow with quiet, efficient purpose. Once she caught him standing at the edge of the trees, just watching the roof line as smoke coiled up from the flue. She wanted to ask why he helped, why he stayed distant, why her when so many others had passed them by. But the days passed and the cold began to soften. By mid-February, a crust of ice gave way to wet mud, and the wind smelled faintly of thawed grass. One morning, Clara stepped out with the pail and found him mending the fence line near the paddock. "You've been kind," she said. He didn't look up. "I've been alive," he replied. She waited, thought maybe he would say more. But he just worked the hammer like it was the only thing that needed doing. That night she sat awake beside the stove long after the children slept. The warmth seeped into her bones, but not deep enough to touch the ache, not the one left by years of silence, of obedience, of waiting for men to decide her fate. The wind knocked once against the barn doors and then was gone. In the morning she took Ruth and Eli to the house. Luke opened the door before she knocked, surprised but not displeased. "I thought maybe we could earn our keep," she said. "I can sew. Ruth can read some. Ellie, he's got good hands." Luke stepped aside. The house was rough but cared for. A kitchen with clean pans and swept floors. A table with a missing leg braced by a stack of old ledgers. No photographs, no lace, no woman's touch, only what was needed and little more. She tied her apron and started the kettle. Ruth took to dusting. Eli found a broom. Luke sat at the table and watched them move, quiet as ever. "I don't want pity," Clara said without turning. "You think I'm giving it?" She glanced at him. There was no judgment in his face. No demand. Only the slow, still grief of someone who had seen too much winter and not enough spring. "No," she said. "I don't. The night's not over yet. Subscribe and stay by the fire." By the second month, the snow had pulled back into the ditches and hollows, and the prairie began to breathe again. Dirty patches of brown grass crept across the fields, and the creek behind the barn cracked free of its ice with a groan that echoed like distant thunder. Clara took to rising early, sometimes before the sun, her hands already knowing what to do before her mind had caught up. The barn became hers, not by declaration, but by rhythm. She mucked stalls, mended tack, boiled water for the chickens, and learned the sound of a mule's complaint when it needed shoeing. Ruth helped with chores around the house, her fingers raw but steady as she learned to split kindling. Eli followed Luke like a shadow dragging fence wire and asking questions that made the man grunt or nod in quiet amusement. It was during one of those mornings, mist still low to the ground, that Clara found herself beside Luke at the well. She'd come to draw water and found him tightening the rope pulley with a rusted wrench. "You always work alone?" she asked. He shrugged. "Always did. Before." "Before what?" He wiped his hands with a cloth, not answering. She waited, then let it go. That became their way. A conversation that drifted in and out like wind through a broken door, never forced, never held too long. But things changed. One evening the stove in the barn wouldn't light. Ruth was coughing again. Eli's cheeks flushed. Clara left them wrapped in quilts and made for the house. Luke was on the porch, sharpening a blade. "The flue's clogged," she said, arms tight around herself. "Smoke won't draw." He set down the knife. Didn't ask permission. Just walked with her back to the barn, climbed onto the roof, and cleared it without a word. When he came down, soot streaked his coat, and the stars were already beginning to show between the rafters. "You should be inside," he said, glancing at the children. Clara nodded. "They're strong," she replied, "but they've been cold too long." He watched her a long moment, then reached for the latch of the barn door. "You'll stay in the house tonight. All of you." She hesitated. "I don't want to." "You're not Charity," he said. "You're here. That's all." So they moved. That night, Ruth curled into a bed of quilts on the floor. Eli took the small cot by the stove. Clara sat in the rocker boots, still on hands in her lap. Luke poured her tea, then sat across from her with a quiet that made her feel seen, but not studied. "I was married once," he said, finally staring into the fire. "She died in childbirth. 12 years ago. Never had children. Never tried again." Clara said nothing. Let the words hang in the warm air between them. "Why did you help us?" she asked. He looked at her then, not startled, just open. "Because no one helped her," he said, "and I never forgot what that looked like." The logs popped in the stove. Somewhere outside a coyote called. Clara leaned back in the chair and closed her eyes for a moment. Not sleep, just rest. The kind that had eluded her for months, maybe years. Her breath slowed. Her shoulders dropped. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it was something like peace. In the days that followed, Luke invited Eli to help with the colts, gave Ruth a book from his father's shelf, asked Clara's thoughts on crop rotation like she'd lived on that land all her life. He never presumed, never pushed. And slowly, Clara began to feel something she hadn't in years. Necessary. The thaw came fast and rough, turning the roads to rivers and the pastures to sponge. The sky shifted finally from gray to wide blue, and the sun laid its hand on the land like a blessing long withheld. Luke let Clara take charge of the garden beds behind the house. She brought out old seeds from her satchel, beans, squash onions wrapped in wax paper, and began carving the frozen earth into order. Ruth helped sleeves rolled fingernails black with dirt. Eli brought water from the creek in tin pails, sloshing more on his boots than on the soil, but proud all the same. Clara worked until her arms ached, not because anyone asked it of her, but because the work gave her shape. The days moved not in hours, but in tasks: sewing, tending, feeding, fixing. And in the quiet moments when her hands were still, her mind wandered less. Luke kept his distance still, but in a way that felt like respect, not reluctance. They shared meals most evenings now. He never sat first. Always waited until she and the children had taken what they needed. Once, while Ruth braided her hair by lantern light, Clara watched Luke at the stove setting out cups. "You always this careful?" she asked. He didn't turn. "Only since I learned what happens when you aren't." She knew what that meant. Everyone had a story like that out here, some mistake, some loss. Folks didn't speak of it much, but it showed in their silences, in how they touched a railing before stepping on the porch, or how they scanned the sky before planning a day's work. The next morning the sheriff rode out. He came slow, dust lifting behind him, his coat sharp and clean in the light. Luke was out front chopping wood. Clara was inside drying dishes when she saw the rider through the window. Her stomach dropped. She stepped out just as the man swung down from his horse. "Luke," he said, nodding. "Harlan." The two men looked at each other like men who'd once shared trust but now only shared a past. "I heard you've taken in some folks." Luke didn't answer. The sheriff looked past him at Clara. "There's been talk," he said. "Some folks down in Whitlow say a woman and her young ones were turned off a ranch up there. Starved near to death. Folks wonder if they made it through the freeze." Clara lifted her chin. Her hands shook, but she steadied them against her skirt. "We made it," she said. The sheriff studied her face. "Good. Glad to hear it." But his tone said he wasn't here to wish them well. Luke stepped forward. "They're staying with me. You've got no business out here unless there's a crime." Harlan narrowed his eyes. "Just keeping the peace, Luke. Folks get nervous when the order of things changes." "The order of things," Luke said, voice flat. "You mean when someone offers help instead of turning their back?" The silence that followed was thick as mud. The sheriff mounted up again. "You be careful," he said. "Mercy's a fine thing, but some people mistake it for weakness." He turned and rode off without waiting for an answer. Clara didn't speak, just watched the dust trail vanish into the hills. Luke split another log. "He won't be back soon," he said. "But he will come back." Luke nodded. "Probably." They stood there a long while, not speaking. The wind had picked up again, tossing the scent of ash and loam through the air. That night Clara sat long after the children had gone to bed, turning a spoon in her tea. Luke sat across from her, hands resting on the table, eyes quiet. "You don't owe us anything," she said. "I know. But if they come again, they'll find me standing in the same place." His voice didn't rise. He didn't promise safety or justice or any miracle, just that he would stand, that he wouldn't leave. Clara looked at him, then really looked at the lines around his eyes, the worn cuffs of his shirt, the old scar on his knuckle that never quite faded. He wasn't a savior, just a man who'd lived through his own cold years and come out the other side with enough fire left to share. She reached across the table and laid her hand over his. His fingers didn't move at first, then slowly turned to hold hers. Not tightly, just enough. Spring came fully at last, the snow gone from the ridges and the creek running high and brown. The land smelled of mud and green, and the wind carried the distant hum of bees. Clara found herself waking earlier than ever, boots pressed into soft earth, hands raw but steady. The garden was her world now, each row of seeds a promise she could see, touch, and tend. Ruth followed her like a shadow, learning which weeds choked the crops and which dirt to leave undisturbed. Eli ran between them, chasing the sun, laughing at the puddles, and for the first time in months, Clara's chest ached, not with fear but with something warmer, hope. Luke watched them from the porch most mornings, axe resting across his knees. He never offered help unless asked, and she rarely did. But sometimes when her back ached from hauling water, he appeared behind her, lifting the pail with quiet strength. He did not speak, did not ask for thanks. The children, sensing the rhythm, began to trust the presence of his hands as much as their own. One morning, after a week of steady rain, the land smelled sweet and new. Clara was planting beans, Ruth kneeling beside her fingers, working the soil, when Luke approached with a horse blanket draped over his arm. Without a word, he laid it over Eli, who had fallen asleep near the edge of the field, sun baking his small face. Clara's eyes met his briefly. A shadow of understanding passed between them, an acknowledgment of shared effort, survival, and care. It was not love, not yet. But it was an intimacy carved from necessity, and that was often stronger than words. Then came the letters. They arrived in the form of scribbled messages from distant kin, reminders of debts unpaid and ties that were not so easily broken. One letter demanded rent owed to a distant uncle. Another hinted at the legal claim of a neighbor over part of Luke's property. Clara read them silently by the fire, her stomach twisting. She folded each carefully and placed them in a box under her bed. She didn't speak of them. Luke noticed, but he said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than words. Weeks later, the challenge came in the form of a stranger riding hard and fast into the barnyard. He was sharp-eyed, cruel-mouthed, and dripping with the confidence of men who believed their claims could be forced with no thought to the lives they crushed. He demanded payment, questioned ownership, and hinted at a reckoning that Clara could feel in the tightening of her chest. Luke met him at the edge of the fence, calm as ever, voice steady, but Clara could see the tension in his jaw, the faint flare of a hand near a concealed revolver. The man left only after a long pause, his threat hanging in the spring air like smoke. The encounter left Clara hollow and shaking, aware of the precariousness of their new life. The days that followed were quiet but heavy. Ruth asked questions too sharp for her years. Eli clung closer. Clara carried their small needs like stones in her pockets, heavy but necessary. And Luke, when he joined them for evening meals, began speaking of small things, the dreams he had once entertained for the land, the promise he had made to himself long ago, and the rare moments when he felt something like contentment. Clara listened. She shared her own cautious dreams, teaching Ruth to read better, planning what they might plant next year, and even daring to imagine a life beyond mere survival. By midsummer, the garden was flourishing. The first squash ripened golden in the sunbeams, clung to their poles, and the cornstalks reached taller than Ruth's head. Clara's hands bore the calluses of work, but her heart had learned its own resilience. And then one evening, as the sun set in molten gold over the ridges, Luke stood beside her on the porch, eyes soft in the fading light. "I reckon," he said, voice low, "that we've done well." She turned, unsure if he spoke of the land, the children, or the fragile, unspoken bond between them. He didn't clarify. She didn't need him to. Clara reached out, laying her hand over his. He let her hold it, thumb brushing over hers, a quiet reassurance. They stood like that for a long time, the air warm around them, the prairie stretching endless and patient before their eyes. Here was work. Here was survival. And somewhere quietly was trust, the first thread of something neither of them had dared name yet. That night she tucked Eli into bed and kissed Ruth's forehead, then sat by the fire. Luke joined her, not pressing, not demanding, but simply present. And in the hush of the evening, Clara let herself feel it, a possibility, fragile but growing, that even in a land harsh and indifferent, a life could be built one choice at a time. The fire had burned low when Luke spoke again, his voice a murmur beneath the crackle of old cedar. "I've been thinking about building a second house," he said. "Smaller, down past the creek near that stand of cottonwoods." Clara didn't answer right away. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers laced tight. She kept her eyes on the flame as if it might speak the truth before she had to. "You want us to move down there?" she asked finally. "No," he said. "Not unless you wanted to. I was thinking it might be for someone else someday. Someone who didn't expect to stay but ended up making roots." His meaning hung there between them, plain and quiet. She swallowed hard. There was a time when such a thing would made her pull away, when any talk of permanence felt like another kind of trap. But this wasn't that. Not with him. Luke never asked her to be less than what she was, never made her feel beholden. His steadiness was the kind that left space, the kind you could build a life inside if you were ready. She looked at him then. Really looked. His shirt was patched at the shoulder. There was dirt under his nails, sun in the creases beside his eyes. But his gaze was steady, waiting not with expectation but with patience. "Why me?" she asked. He shrugged slightly, as if the answer didn't need much ceremony. "Because you stayed when you could have run. Because you work harder than most men I've known. Because you don't ask for much, but you give everything to those children. Because you don't smile often, but when you do, it feels like the sun finally came out." She let out a breath that wasn't quite a laugh. Her hands tightened, then loosened. "It's not easy," she said. "I don't expect easy," he replied. "Just honest." Clara stood and walked to the window. Outside, the night pressed soft against the panes. The fields were dark, the air still. Somewhere an owl called low from the ridge. She thought of all the roads she'd walked, all the doors that had stayed shut, and the ones that had closed too hard. She thought of the children asleep in the next room, of the slow, quiet peace that had settled in the bones of this house. And she thought of Luke, not as a rescuer, not as a man who gave her shelter, but as a man who stood beside her, not in front. She turned back toward him. "I don't want to be a guest forever," she said. "You're not. And I don't want to marry because it's expected or because people start talking. I wouldn't ask you to. But I might want to. Someday. If it's something we build ourselves." He stood then, slow and careful, like a man stepping across a line he'd been waiting to reach. "We've already started," he said. Clara nodded. The fire popped once, soft and warm. The next morning they walked the field together, side by side. Eli chased a grasshopper ahead of them, shrieking with delight. Ruth carried a basket full of early squash, proud and quiet. The sun rose over the ridge, lighting the world in pale gold. As they reached the edge of the creek, Luke paused. "There," he said, pointing. "I was thinking here. For the house." Clara looked out over the land. The cottonwoods swayed above the bank leaves, whispering. The soil was rich and the ground flat, a good place for roots. She reached down, dug her fingers into the earth, lifted a handful of dirt, and let it crumble between her fingers. "All right," she said. "Let's build something." And just like that it began, not with vows or rings or declarations, but with a handful of earth and a shared gaze, steady and sure. Subscribe and see what tomorrow brings over the ridge.